Hello and welcome to episode 35 of Abbasid History Podcast, an audio platform to examine pre-modern Islamic history and a global medieval past, and our second installment of a 12-part series entitled A Spring of Classical Arabic Poetry with Dr. Kevin Blankinship at Brigham Young University in Utah, Part 9, Ibn Zaydūn, 1003 to 1071 Common Era. An introduction to Andalusian poetry. We're sponsored by IHRC Bookshop. Listeners get a 15% discount on all purchases. Visit IHRC Bookshop at shop.ihrc.org and use discount code AHP15 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Contact IHRC Bookshop for details. I'm your host Al-Hassan, a PhD student at School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Now on to the show. Abu al-Walīd Aḥmad Ibn Zaydūn al-Makhzūmī, or simply known as Ibn Zaydūn, was considered the greatest neoclassical poet of al-Andalus. His love affair with the princess and poet Wallada and his exile inspired many of his poems. To discuss with me the life, work and legacy of Ibn Zaydūn is Dr. Kevin Blankinship. Welcome again, Dr. Blankinship.
Hi Talha, it's good to be with you.
Ibn Zaydūn grew up during the decline of the Caliphate of Córdoba. What do we know about his socio-political context? And also, tell us about Arabic literature in Andalus more generally.
Ibn Zaydūn lived in an era of political instability surrounding the end of the Cordoban Umayyad Caliphate, as you mentioned. Just as a brief rundown for listeners, and many of you are probably familiar with this history already, we have sort of this, after the conquest, the Muslim conquest of sort of the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula in 711 AD, there was a period of about 40 years, which we might call the Age of the Emirs. And this was an era of expansion also. From 756 to about 929, if we want to draw a hard line, this was the independent Umayyad Emirate at Seville and then Cordoba, founded by Abdurrahman I, known as Ad-Dakhil, the entrant, or Saqr Quraysh, the Falcon of Quraysh, who very famously fled Damascus after the Umayyad Caliphate was overthrown, and the Abbasids took over after that. For the next century or so was a period of strength and consolidation, and then sort of this slide into anarchy, and thereafter from like 912 to 929, more years of expansion, to the point where in January 929, Abdurrahman III declared himself a caliphate, probably to rival the power of the Fatimids. It was once thought that he did this in order to sort of poke at the Abbasids and rival their power, but more likely it was that, the Fatimids had just, within the past 2 decades established their power in North Africa as a caliphate. And so to rival them, the Umayyads at Cordoba most likely declared themselves caliphs, or declared itself a caliphate as well. From 929 to 1031, they ruled with relative power and strength, except for the last sort of 2 decades of that period, which is known as the Fitna of al-Andalus, after which the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba disintegrated into Ta'ifa city-states. And there are about 39 of these, and they sort of break down more or less along 2 lines. One, there were these sort of Arab patrician states like Seville, Saragossa, and Cordoba, versus both old and new Berber-ruled states or Amazigh-ruled states like Badajoz and Toledo. As I mentioned, the caliphate disintegrated in the early 11th century during what's known as the Fitna of al-Andalus, a civil war between the descendants of Caliph Hisham II and the successors of his chamberlain or Hajib al-Mansur. So upon the death of al-Hakam II in 976, the Caliphate of Cordoba was still a powerful state, and after his death of al-Hakam, the son, Hisham II al-Hakam, was still a child. And what this meant was that the vizier al-Mansur was able to seize power and turn the caliph into a puppet, basically. And then to conserve his power, al-Mansur favored the Berbers over the other groups. Similar accommodation in the pecking order went to al-Mansur's son, Abd al-Malik al-Muzaffar, when he succeeded his father to the throne. To make things worse, various rival groups were vying for power, and this threatened government security. Abd al-Malik died in 1008, leaving his brother Abdurrahman Sanchuelo in power. and Sanchuelo was able to convince Hisham II to name him the rightful heir to the caliphate. And for the remaining Umayyad members, this marked sort of their last straw, and they proceeded to launch a full-scale coup d'etat and revolt against the state. So this so-called fitna of al-Andalus lasted from about 1009 AD to 1031. And then at 1031, after these years of infighting, the caliphate fractured into several independent Muslim Ta'ifa city-states, as I mentioned. There's this stereotype upon the conquest about a century later of the Almoravids, who swept in and took over most of these city-states, these Ta'ifa city-states. This stereotype of increasingly strict dynasties coming to power after the fall of those city-states to the Almoravids and then later the Almohads. There's a couple of lines on this by Ibn Quzman, one of the two best-known poets of strophic poetry, especially the Zajjal poem, which came to be in several places throughout the Islamic world at this time, one of them being the Iberian Peninsula. So he says about the incoming Almoravids, I said what I had in mind, that's my excuse. Here I make a stop and my Zajjal ends. You're the Almoravids. I know the story. You've never liked anything lavish. So here Ibn Quzman is expressing sentimentality for this Ta'ifa period where these independent city-states kind of rule. There's this sort of impression that we have of cosmopolitanism there, patronage for the arts, etc., versus the Almoravid period, which in the eyes of someone like Ibn Quzman represents more sort of a provincial and strict society. But for someone like Ibn Zaydūn, it was the Ta'ifa period that was the bitter reminder of a former golden era under the Umayyads, rather than an era of political and cultural freedom as portrayed by Ibn Quzman.
Ibn Zaydūn was born in 1003 in Cordoba to an aristocratic Andalusian Arab family and was involved in the political life of his age. What do we know about Ibn Zaydūn's life?
As you mentioned, Talha, he was born to an illustrious family, and he had a youth marked by the political instability, as I mentioned, but also an erudite court setting. He joined the court of the Jawarid Abul Hazm of Cordoba and eventually rose to the rank of vizier. And then, accused of plotting against his patron, he was jailed and escaped, fleeing the city. And eventually he returned to serve Ibn Jahwar's son, al-Walīd. After several more intrigues, he entered the service of al-Mu'tadid of Seville, and then later that of his son al-Mu'tabid ibn Abbad, himself a renowned poet. Ibn Zaydūn returned to Cordoba with his patron when the latter seized it and made it the Abbadid capital. And Ibn Zaydūn died while on a mission to Seville to help quell a civil disturbance there. His reputation, Ibn Zaydūn's reputation and persona are linked most especially to his stormy love affair with the Umayyad princess Wallada bint al-Mustakfi, a brilliant and sharp-tongued Umayyad princess who was born toward the end of the Cordoban Umayyad Caliphate, and she lived to be part of the Ta'ifa city-state culture through her own life and poetry. She was famous for her court of learning, literary salons, many centuries before France's legendary Madame de Rambouillet held sway over her literary salon. So Wallada would gather poets, musicians, and others, the finest in al-Andalus, and they would sit around on cushions and rugs improvising ballads and epic sagas to the sound of the lute. Wallada was heiress, I guess, to the Umayyads' Navarrese white skin and blue eyes. She was fair-skinned and famous for her blue eyes. She refused to wear the veil when she was walking in the city in order to flaunt her beauty. She supposedly wore a somewhat transparent tunic, to be provocative, of course, and had the following verses of her own poetry embroidered on either side of this tunic. By God, I am meant for the haughty heights as I walk my little walk and strut my swagger. I set a place for my lover in the round of my cheek and give my kiss to the one who's hungry for it. The second line is a likely reference to Ibn Zaydūn. Wallada was also notorious for the freedom of her amorous adventures, and about which she wrote in often scathing verses. The most famous of her liaisons, of course, was with Ibn Zaydūn, which he wrote about in dozens of his poems and sort of mythologized as a Romeo and Juliet tale in Arabic literary history. Ibn Zaydūn and Wallada were not quiet about their affair. At Wallada's literary circle, when the poets started improvising, they would allude to it quite openly. So on one famous occasion, Wallada gave this impromptu verse as she was gazing at Ibn Zaydun. I fear for you so much that even my own sight, even the ground you tread, even the hours that pass threaten to snatch you away from me. Even if I could hide you within the pupils of my eyes until the day of judgment, my fear would still not be dispelled. And Ibn Zaydun, returning her lover's glance just as passionately, responded, your passion has made me famous among high and low. Your face devours my feelings and thoughts. When you're absent, I can't be consoled, but when you appear, all my cares fly away. Ibn Zaydun's prestige as the leading poet and the lover of the most beautiful woman of Cordoba awakened a lot of jealousy among rivals, especially Ibn Abdus, who was the caliph's vizier. Ibn Abdus created a venomous intrigue, tried to destroy his enemy's friendship with the caliph and his romance with Wallada. At first he failed, but supposedly Ibn Abdus caught Ibn Zaydun in flagrante delicto with Wallada's favorite slave, an African girl. And the princess, Wallada, was so hurt that she wrote Ibn Zaydun a poem of rebuke. If you had been truly sincere in the love which joined us, you wouldn't have preferred one of my own slaves. In so doing, you scorned the bough, which blossoms with beauty, and chose a branch which bears only hard and bitter fruit. You know that I am the clear, shining moon of the heavens, but to my sorrow, you chose instead Jupiter, i.e., a dark and shadowy planet. So here she is comparing herself favorably to this African slave, and referring, of course, to the fact that Wallada was fair-skinned and the slave was dark-skinned. Another time, Wallada rebuked Ibn Zaydun for blaming her, and she implies that Ibn Zaydun was in a homosexual relationship with a servant named Ali. And here we get a little taste of Wallada's more scathing poetry. Ibn Zaydun, despite his virtue, insults me unjustly, though I've done no wrong. When I come near, he looks askance at me like I'm about to castrate Ali. And going even further, Ibn Zaydun's backside swoons for the rods in men's pants. If it saw a penis atop a palm tree, it would swoop down on it like a vulture. So Wallada was no shrinking violet, as these verses can attest. Ibn Abdus then made his rival jealous by letting it be known Wallada had taken him as her lover, and by walking beside her in the streets of Cordoba. And of course, this wounded Ibn Zaydun to the core. And so he wrote bitter lines like these to the woman he thought had spurned him. You were for me nothing but a sweetmeat. I took a bite of it and then tossed away the crust to be gnawed by a rat. Taking the court vizier Ibn Abdus as her lover, in turn led to Ibn Zaydun's imprisonment as well. This is obviously one advantage of being vizier and wanting to put away your rival.
The themes of love, lost youth, and nostalgia for his city are present in many of Ibn Zaydun's poems. How would you characterize his work?
So in Arabic literary history and memory, no lost gardens are better recalled than those of the palace city of Madinat az-Zahra, just outside modern-day Cordoba, and sacked during the civil wars that brought the Umayyad Caliphate to an end. And in the poetry that made the Ta'ifa city-states a glorious literary era, the memory and ruins of these lost gardens of Cordoba play sort of a mournful, wistful role. So here are opening lines from a qasida by Ibn Zaydun describing Madinat az-Zahra and its beauty in order to lament its former glory. With passion from this place, az-Zahra, I remember you. Horizon clear, limpid. The face of earth and wind, come twilight, desists. A tenderness sweeps me when I see the silver coiling waterways, like necklaces detached from throats. Delicious those days we spent while fate slept. There was peace, I mean, and us, thieves of pleasure. Now, only flowers with frost-bent stems I see. But Ibn Zaydun also wrote several prose works. For example, he has a letter to his friend Abu Amr ibn Maslama in Seville after escaping prison and asking this Abu Amr to intercede with al-Mu'tadid on his behalf. He also wrote a history of the Spanish Umayyad caliphs, Kitab at-Tabyin fi Khulafa Bani Umayya bil-Andalus, the exposition on the Umayyad caliphs in al-Andalus. But Ibn Zaydun's best-known prose works are two epistles, the earnest epistle and the comic epistle. And the comic epistle imagines Wallada's reply to Ibn Abdus after he wrote her trying to win her affections. Remember, Ibn Abdus is Ibn Zaydun's rival for her love. A fictitious messenger delivers the letter and flatters Ibn Abdus, but Wallada rejects the vizier's offer in no uncertain terms. You are deformed by birth, unsurpassed in stupidity, cruel by nature, hard of hearing, boorish in response, despicable in appearance, clumsy in coming and going, endowed with putrid breath, possessed of abundant defects, and renowned for your vices. Your speech is a stutter, your conversation a mutter, your discourse a clutter. Your laugh is a cackle, and your gait a scamper. Your wealth is beggary, your religion heresy, and your learning braggery. I can't take credit for that translation. It's by Devon Stewart, and it is masterful. These prose works I mention are all that we know survives, but they're probably just a fraction of what Ibn Zaydūn would have written during his long career as a courtier and a government official. Among some of Ibn Zaydūn's other works are lengthy eulogies, presumably written to further his political ambitions, and also a famous qasida mimiya, so an ode rhyming in meme, written from prison to arouse his jailer's sympathies and get him to help him out. Ibn Zaydūn's personal history vividly brings together the political and the personal, and I'll talk a bit about this later when I read a poem at the end. But the historical record speaks to his passionate political engagement with Cordoba as well as with Wallada. So on the level of the political and the personal, and these two are often read together in Arabic literary history when analyzing his poetry.
According to Salma Jayyusi in her book The Legacy of Muslim Spain, Ibn Zaydūn brought into Andalusi poetry something of balance, the rhetorical command, the passionate power and grandeur of style that marked contemporary poetry in the East. He rescued Andalusi poetry from the self-indulgence of the poets of externalized description, end quote. How would you characterize Ibn Zaydūn's legacy?
The 14th century Arabic literary critic Khalil ibn Aybak al-Safadi defines the word dharf, sophistication, maybe even dandyism is sometimes how it's translated, or elegance, a prized quality in pre-modern Arab social and literary circles. So according to al-Safadi, the true sophisticate, or dharif, wears robes of white and rings of carnelian, recites the Quran according to the reading of Abu Amr, knows the sacred law according to the tradition of ash-Shafi'i, and recites the poetry of Ibn Zaydūn. So this recipe for social polish shows how highly people regarded Ibn Zaydūn's poetry, and to this day it's still memorized. In fact, his most famous poem, the Nuniyya, which I'll read in translation in a moment, was the subject of many mu'aradat, that is, imitations, poetic imitations in the same rhyme and meter, during the poet's lifetime and afterward. The Mamluk poet Safi ad-Din al-Halli, whom we'll discuss in an upcoming episode, wrote an imitation of it to eulogize the Ayyubid ruler, al-Malik al-Mu'ayyid Imad ad-Din. That poem is in the form of a mukhammas, a very popular verse form in African Arabic poetry that takes an existing poem, and for every line it interpolates 5 original lines, both as a commentary and as an original poem itself. The Nuniyya of Ibn Zaydūn stood for longing and exile to such a degree in people's minds that for anyone who memorized it, it was rumored that that person was certain to die far from home. As for prose, Ibn Nubata al-Misri wrote a long commentary on Ibn Zaydūn's comic epistle, and As-Safadi wrote his own commentary on the earnest epistle. If you spend time in North Africa today, which if you get the chance to do, you should, Ibn Zaydūn is a canonical name that everyone still recognizes, along figures like Ibn Khaldun and Ibn Arabi, who we'll also discuss in the next episode. Ibn Zaydūn's exploits have also inspired some modern literary works, including Ali al-Jarim's Hatif min al-Andalus and a play by Faruq Juwaida, al-Wazir al-Ashiq. And for further reading, I'd recommend Devon Stewart's entry on Ibn Zaydūn in the Cambridge History of Arabic Literature volume on the literature of al-Andalus. Terry DeYoung also has an article on him, an introductory article on him in the Essays in Arabic Literary Biography, Volume 2, 925 to 1350. Salma Jayyusi, as you mentioned, Talha, talks about him in The Legacy of Muslim Spain, Volume 1, in the section called Language and Literature. And of course, James Monroe's book, Hispano-Arabic Poetry, gives a good introduction as well as translation of some of his work.
And finally, let's end with a sample and translation.
So, The poem that I'm going to read is the famous Nuniyya on lamenting his separation from Wallada, which many people have read and still read as a thinly veiled lament on his separation from Cordoba and the fall of the Umayyad Caliphate at Cordoba. So, however you want to read it, if you're inclined to see the personal in the political and vice versa, that's perfectly acceptable interpretation that's been given before. And this is in the translation of Michael Sells, who always does a beautiful job rendering what can be very difficult Arabic into limpid, smooth English. So the Nuniyya of Ibn Zaydūn, or poem in N of Ibn Zaydūn. Morning came, the separation, substitute for the love we shared, for the fragrance of our coming together, falling away. The moment of departure came upon us, fatal morning. The crier of our passing ushered us through death's door. Who will tell them, who, by leaving, cloak us in a sorrow not worn away with time, though time wears us away? That time used to make us laugh when they were near returns to make us grieve. We poured for one another the wine of love. Our enemies seethed and called for us to choke, and fate said, let it be. The knot our two souls tied came undone, and what our hands joined was broken. We never used to give a thought to separation, and now for us to be together again is beyond our dreams. How I wish I knew, and I have given your rivals no satisfaction, if ours have won a share from you. Keeping faith in you now you are gone, is the only creed we hold, our religion. What is our fault that you cool the envier's eye, satisfying one who takes pleasure in our misfortune? To give up hope, we thought, might bring relief, but it only made desire for you burn deeper. You left. We went our way, ribs still scorched, longing for you, tears still welling in our eyes. When our secret thought whispered in your ear, sorrow would have crushed us had we not held on to one another. Our days turned in losing you and darkened, while nights with you glowed. When life bounded free in the intimacy we gave, when the meadows of our pleasure were pure. Night traveler, lightning, go early to the palace and offer a drink to no one who poured us her pure love freely, and ask if thoughts of us trouble a lover as the memory of her possesses our troubled mind. O fragrant breath of the east wind, bring greetings to one whose kind word would revive us even from a distance. Will she not, through the long pass of time, grant us consideration, however often, however well we plead? Fostered in royalty as if God shaped her from musk, and we mere humans from clay, or formed her in pure silver and crowned her with gold unalloyed, new creation and glory. When she bends, her necklace weighs her down, bracelets bruise her skin, so tender. Within her veils, she is the nursling of the sun, though it touches her barely, as if on the curve of her cheek the star of Venus were given, amulet and charm. What harm is it we are not of her station? In love, and it is equal, and it is enough, we are equal. We can find no drink like loving you. Even as it quenches, it leaves us thirsting more. Nothing can divert our gaze from the horizon of the beauty of your star. Bitterness cannot turn us from it. Not by choice did we withdraw from time so near. Time's twist, destiny, turned us against our will. As the wine is mixed and sparkles, and singers perform their trance of song, we ache for you. The passing round of the cup of wine brings out in us no mark of repose, the sound of a lute, no forgetting. Be true to our vow as we have been. The noble give back loyally as given. If from its towering course the night's full moon bent toward us, she would not, forgive the thought, stir our desire. I am left sad, keeping the faith, though you have shut me out. A phantom will be enough, memories suffice. Though in this world we could not afford you, we'll find you in the stations of the last assembly and pay the price. A response from you would be something, if only what you offered you gave. God bless you. Long as our love for you still burns, the love we hide, the love that gives us away.
Dr. Blankinship, thank you.
Thank you, Talha.